You think I should get started or wait for the ITI folks to roll in?
What time is it?
7:05.
What do you expect?
Are there any like trivial slides before?
I mean, yeah, I was gonna go over. I made a couple of terminology mistakes last time, so I can go over that. Yeah. Yeah, this is your meeting flag. Hopefully that should be up. It's about Kerberos delegation. So yeah, I will explain what this means momentarily. Okay, so yeah, we're going over today. As last time we were going over like basic attacks you could do when you pop into an Active Directory domain. This is going to be more about domain privilege escalation. So like say you get an unprivileged user account, what are some really common ways folks are getting up to like domain admin or other compromises like that? And I'm going to include in here, there's going to be a couple primitives of like, hey, there are some things here you can take advantage of to go escalate your privileges. Here's why they exist, what problem they were looking to solve. And then I'll also go over, there are some default settings that are dangerous that are left on for AD for, of course, back compat with a number of like very legit things. And if you have enough of these, you can do a full domain takeover just from an unprivileged account, which is a really fun attack chain. It's kind of complicated, but it's totally worth knowing because, of course, if you could just hop onto any old AD domain and do a full domain takeover, like that's a really big deal. And they'll get us some other various things, DACL exploitation, which is kind of like if you think your host privilege escalation, but like, you know, over a domain, and then cross DC attacks, which is when you compromise a child domain or a child forest. How do you hop up to one level above? And it's actually really easy in most cases. So I want to go over some mistakes made last time. Most of these are just me misspeaking. Every time I said sign, I meant to say encrypt. I have been brain rotted by the PK-init architecture. And then also, when I was thinking signatures, I was thinking of the MIC, the message integrity code, which I'll go over today, actually. But that is totally separate. So Kerberos, there is no signatures. It's all encryption via like public key, like asymmetric type cryptography. And that is how Kerberos works. Another major thing I had, and this is a just conceptual thing that I got tripped up on, so I had a couple domains I hacked through where I do Kerberos login and somehow dump hashes and find the NTLM hash. In that case, I was mistaken. That means they did an NTLM login on top of the Kerberos login separately, and I was not tracking it because I just tested this over the weekend. I set up like a driver exploit to go dump LSAS, and every time somebody was logging in, it would only cache their Kerberos TGS, which completely makes sense theoretically. So I was mistaken due to having a couple domains that were set up weirdly that I'd hacked through. When somebody logs into a box with a Kerberos TGS and you dump it, all you will get is TGS. They need an NTLM login to dump the NTLM hash, which I think makes sense. The last thing is I did some digging because I was curious. I was like, hey, has anybody ever actually successfully reset the Kirby TGT password? The answer is yes and no. You're playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets if you go change the Kirby TGT password hash. If you have the modern AES encryption set up, allegedly that will break things. If you have the old stuff, it seems to be okay. There is a now deprecated unmaintained PowerShell script from Microsoft. Change your Kirby TGT password hash. And, you know, I think the fact they haven't maintained it in 6 years speaks volumes as to the reliability of doing this. So yeah, you can do it. I don't know what'll happen. Nobody seems to really know what'll happen. So I figured I'd put that out there. So saying that Kirby TGT password hash can't be changed is not strictly true. It's just that it will probably break a whole lot of things. So, okay, cool. With that said, before I get into anything today, because today really marks where the difficulty picks up on the red team side, does anyone have any residual questions from either the last like AD meeting or just anything at all related to something we've covered before? Because it's going to get like, I think, a little more difficult here on out. No? Okay, cool. And the other thing I was going to say is if you guys have the ability to go hack through any Active Directory environments, like say a network on Hack the Box, that would definitely go a long way in terms of just getting practice exploiting these things. Because a lot of it is more about knowing the theory than doing the practice, because the practice, if you understand what's going on, is as easy as like 3 to 4 commands for each of these vulnerabilities. And once you have it down, you can race through and be able to exploit like something like constrained delegation, which I'll go over in like 5 minutes flat. So, you know, it really is about understanding. There's a lot of great tooling for going after all of these because they're all popular targets. All right, so today is about mostly more Kerberos. It is the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah. So this is a very, very famous thing. You might see it come up on an interview question because I had some Kerberos questions when I was doing my interviews. So what happens when you have a situation like this, where let's say you have service A and service B, and your typical example for this is service B is a database, service A is a web app. Your web app needs to talk to your database and the current user context to go pull some data and go run, right? But we want to go make sure we're still authorized as whoever is logged into service A. So how do we actually do Kerberos access control here, right? If our identity is the client, what do we do at a protocol level to be able to authenticate to service B from service A when service A is not the client? And this is a really annoying problem. Like if you ever set up an AD domain, like this will get you almost immediately, and it's a real pain to go deal with it. So I was gonna say before I get into this, does anybody have any ideas of what we could do to go do this authentication? If you recall, I have the 6-step process up here of how a normal TGT to TGS authentication works. Does anyone have any ideas? There's not really anything right or wrong here because I feel like Microsoft has tried them all. Yeah.
Client requests 2 TGSs, one for A and B, and then gives the TGS for B to A.
That would be really smart and secure, but the issue is they need to do it when A wants to, not when the client wants to. So I guess you could build some extension out that says whenever you auth to A, you must also generate a TGS to B, and that would do it. That does not currently exist. That would be way better than anything we have now, which I find very, very funny. That is in fact a much better idea than any of the solutions. So let's get into the solutions because this one's pretty comical. Unconstrained delegation. This one is fantastic. So Microsoft, in their infinite wisdom, instead of doing what you did, said, let's just give service A the TGT for anyone that logs into it. We're just going to bundle it in there and sign it for them. So service A gets to go have it. Yeah, this is a bad idea. I'm just going to spoil that right now. So the idea here is that instead of giving that TGS to service B, like Chris suggested, we're just going to give them the client's TGT on top of their TGS to A. And then service A will just talk back to the domain controller with said TGT and say, hey, can I get a TGS onto service B? And they'll go through that whole chain there, which I would hope this is like decently intuitive as to how this would work. The idea is that service A is doing everything client would be able to do. It's doing it when service A wants to, instead of when the client wants to. And this does, to Microsoft's credit, this does solve the problem. This will fix and let them authenticate whenever service A would need to. And the sort of side effect of this is that now service A will be holding this TGT in memory. And to turn this on your domain, just take a box. You can see there's a little screenshot there of what you would do to go turn the setting on. And that is unconstrained delegation. So there's a problem with unconstrained delegation. So I don't know if you guys recall when I was talking about the authentication coercion vulnerabilities, but we have the ability in a number of ways to go force authentication under a machine account context. So the issue is we have a host and we're forwarding TGTs into it. Okay. Well, if anybody can do authentication coercion against the domain controller at will to get that authentication out, then if I compromise the host that's getting TGTs forwarded to it, what happens if I sit on that host and I say, hey, domain controller, authenticate to me? So they do that and I pull their TGT out and then I run Rubius and rip the TGT out and oh no, I have a TGT as a domain controller machine account. And I can just request a TGS onto the domain controller and say, hey, domain controller, I would like to get a TGS onto your SIFS service, which is like your files. And I would like to use that to go run in-packet secrets dump and dump everything in your domain. And that will totally work. So the old chain to do this would be you'd use the printer bug, which is an authentication coercion primitive, and you'd use a Rubius command called monitor, which will just sit and print whenever a new ticket comes in. So you just go into your compromised host that is trusted for unconstrained delegation, and you run Rubius, and Rubius sits and sits and sits and sits. And then you open up a new terminal, you run printer bug, and it'll go hit the DC. DC will go authenticate to your Rubius. Boom, new TGT is a DC. And then you can just pass the ticket and in-packet secrets done with the domain controller. So that is like a way to speed run your full domain compromised, right? So I said petit patam because that's like what I've been using. I'm pretty sure printer bug is like the OG way of doing this. And that's sort of your flow. And of course, you could also trigger the off coercion from service A. It'll work because you could pick where it gets pointed to. So yeah, does everyone understand why forwarding TGTs is dangerous and scary? Okay, cool. Yeah, so this came about around, I think, 2000, if I have to say. And now if you have credential guard turned on, they will not allow you to turn the setting on that computer because it is widely recognized as being super dangerous. But it does still exist. The only machine in your domain that should be trusted for unconstrained delegation is the domain controller. Because if you think about the threat model of this, it doesn't really get you anything, with one major exception, which I'll go into later. So that's the idea behind unconstrained delegation, is if we get on a host that allows it to get more TGTs, then we can pretty much do anything the domain controller would do. So unconstrained delegation is a primitive that'll let us become anyone, anywhere. And if you recall the name for that last time, well, that would be the same access as a golden ticket. So that's why it's so dangerous. All right, so we know that TGT forwarding is too permissive. So how can we restrict it a little bit more? So the idea now is, maybe instead of forwarding the entire TGT, we restrict it to a TGS instead. So in this case, we can request TGS for another user using the services ticket granting ticket, right? So we basically say, hey, service, you're allowed to go pull TGSs for this thing over there. And it's like at a specific like service level. So if you recall when I gave you like the silly little mnemonic, Kerberos tickets let you do stuff to things, well, you get to do one, like set of capabilities to one thing instead of being able to become everyone everywhere, like unconstrained delegation. So this lets us become any user on a specific service to a specific host if we were to like get into service A and compromise it. So does anyone know any problems with this? And there's a kind of obvious one and there's a really not obvious one. There's two kind of things I'm thinking of here. All right, surely somebody can tell me the obvious problem with this.
SQL server contains like password hashes.
Mhm.
Can you just like password hashes or overwrite every?
Correct. Yeah. So there's actually no precondition. You can just always do this. And so that is pretty much exactly what I was going for. This is basically a silver ticket where I can become anybody to that one service. But there's one really not obvious thing that comes down to the Kerberos spec. Which if you guys recall when I was getting like in the weeds how Kerberos works, some of the fields were encrypted and some of them weren't. And what's really fun about this is the service we authenticate to is not encrypted. So let's say I have constrained delegation onto a harmless service that I can't do anything with, like time, like to NTP syncing, right? Onto some target. Well, I can get a legit TGS for it, and it's not encrypted. So what happens if I go into those 4 characters of time and open bin and do sys, which gives me file access? Well, that's a completely valid TGS, which is a huge problem because remember our security model here is that we get anyone to this one service. But now we can't change the host, but we can change the protocol field, which is the service, right? So what's really scary about this is now we violated this ideal security model, and we can instead become anyone to any SPN on that given host. And this is commonly referred to as like the alt service trick, because there's a Rubius flag called alt service that lets you go change this around like really easily, just switch out what like SPN your TGS lets you go to, and you can't change the computer, but you can change the SPN. And again, this is a very, very scary attack, especially if you don't know this is how Kerberos works, because you could think, hey, it's okay, in terms of my threat model, service A can only access the time service on service B, so even if A is compromised, B is fine. But that's not the case, because we can switch that out for a sys ticket, and then we can secret stump, right? Or do a PS exec or such, and go own B that way. So, somebody reported this vulnerability, and Microsoft's just like, well, this is working as intended, we're not going to change anything. And that has been the case since 2003. So this has been a vulnerability for 22 years. It's not going anywhere. And constrained delegation is still like unconstrained delegation. They're like, don't use it anymore. constrained delegation is still fine, in quotation fingers. So this is a really important trick to know, because if you're doing like your pathfinding something in Bloodhound, and you're like, I have an edge to this like weird service, I don't think I can do anything with it. Maybe you can't, but you can use the alt service trick to go switch it to something like psexec, not psexec, something like SIF service, to be able to psexec and own that target. And of course, like before, we can become any user. So all you have to do is you have to hunt in either of these cases for a user that is a local admin on that target, and then you request a TGS as them, switch the service around, and get it that way. So that is constrained delegation. And there's a really cool flag for this in netexec, which lets you do this like trivially. You just do -- delegate, and you pick whatever user you want to become. So if you want to secret stump it, instead of without running secret stump, you can just do netexec delegate -- sam and dump the entire LSA and SAM database like in one line. This is a very fun attack to pull off, because when you see it, you feel very high speed. You could do it in like a minute, you know, and keep on rolling through the network. So yeah, this is still safer than unconstrained delegation, but there's the problem of we can pivot into that B computer pretty easily as soon as we hit A. So this is why trust is still very, very dangerous here in the context of how Kerberos is running. So yeah, constrained delegation, safer than unconstrained delegation, still dangerous and can be used for privilege escalation. Now, before I get into the last type of delegation, which is a little more mind-bending, there's a couple Kerberos extensions we need to go over. One of these is actually already used in that constrained delegation chain, and that is S4U to self and S4U to proxy. So the idea is a service should be able to obtain a TGS for a user to itself. And this kind of makes sense, because if you think about it, if we're talking to the domain controller, all we need to do to supply that, to go through our 6-step chain, is the machine account password hash, which it knows, right? That is what it rightfully is, at least in the case of S4U to self. So the idea is, if I'm a computer and I'm tracking my own like access, like SPN as like, hey, SIF's service for someone to be able to get file access to me, right? I could make a TGS for a user and give that out. And you would make that, again, with that machine account password or password hash. So the service allowed to request S4U to self for any domain user without them explicitly requesting it. So this is how we were able to do, even if the administrator user didn't ask for this TGS, we need the -f delegate administrator, because we'd have the relevant like secret material. Like in this case, I'm saying we would have like the machine account username and password, and do that with delegate flag to go become that user. So that is what S4U to self is. The practical implication of S4U to self is that anytime you have a machine account password and the machine account username, you can now completely compromise said machine, because you can become any user on it. So you just pick anybody with local admin privileges over the target, make a TGS to something you want, and take it over. That's it. That's S4U to self. S4U to proxy is the extension that lets you obtain a TGS on behalf of a user to another service. I am fairly certain this is only used in constrained delegation, in contrast to S4U to self, which I believe is always on. So, you know, maybe if you guys want to get like deeper in the specs, there's some more nuance there, but that is what I could piece together going through the official documentation for how this is supposed to work. But yeah, the big idea here is if we can do authentication coercion of, say, a machine account, right? Then we could generally pull something like S4U to self, if we did it over Kerberos, to be able to take them over. So that's the idea. And that is very, very important, because we're going to now talk about more machine account abuse. So the resource-based constrained delegation is the final type of delegation. And this one, I at least find this to be kind of confusing, where the idea is, in the past, right, we were giving the privilege on the front. So we were like, okay, server A is a web server B is a database. We're going to let server A like basically grab some kind of material and log into this, right? So we put our extra privilege on the front. RECD says, what if we put that on the back, and instead of doing extra privilege, we say, hey, service B will now accept whatever service A is saying to go do that login. Right, and this requires S4U to self and S4U to proxy as extensions for it to actually go through with this, at least according to the docs that I read. So basically, service A will now go talk to the DC, and service B will trust whatever service A is requesting to be able to go through and do that login. And there's something really interesting about how this is set up. So when you're adding a machine with constrained delegation or unconstrained delegation, you need to be a domain administrator because there's a privilege called SE, enable delegation privilege, that you set up. And this makes sense for your threat model. So I could just arbitrarily spin up unconstrained or constrained delegation. I could be like, hey, the domain controller is going to trust me for constrained delegation and immediately take it over, right? Or unconstrained delegation, you can do the same thing. But RBCD, because we're flipping it around, the permissions can get a little bit looser. Because in this case, you need to have write DACL access on the service B computer, which doesn't necessarily require a domain administrator. It just requires the ability to go talk to the domain controller over LDAP and be like, hey, I have the requisite privilege to go right to this field called, it's a handful, MSDS allowed to act on behalf of other identity. Nice and concise, as usual for Microsoft engineering. And basically, you go right to that flag, and now service B will trust service A. And this might not seem as significant as the other two, but there's like 3 or 4 other prerequisites I can go into in a moment that make this the most dangerous in practice, because you don't need to actually explicitly set this up, which is super cool as an attacker, very uncool as a domain admin. So yeah, the idea for this one again is it's backwards, and you need less privileges to set up the delegation. So I don't know if there's an actual name for this chain. I call it the MAC attack. People sometimes will call it a WebDAV relay. But if we think about the prerequisites, right, to go abuse this, we would need the ability to control service A and then write to the service B attribute to trust A for delegation. So we need to own a principal with an SPM, like a computer, and we need to have a computer on which we can write allowed to act on behalf of other identity, that attribute to. So we need to write that, what should we call it? Believe that means the target. So there's a really interesting setting called machine account quota, and it's by default 10. And it said every domain user with no privileges can add up to 10 machine accounts to the domain by default, which is actually quite scary because now anybody can own a principal with an SPN. So that's one of the prerequisites, right? We can just create a computer. Now, the other really interesting piece of the puzzle is that if you remember our auth relaying talk, right, we can take a piece of authentication, push it out to different protocols. And we have authentication coercion. So what happens if we set up a relay and we say, okay, I want to take my inbound authentication and point that to LDAP on the domain controller. Because what's our target? Our target is performing a privileged write to our victim's act on behalf of their identity. Okay, cool. So what we're going to go do is we're going to go set up this relay. We're going to do an auth coercion attack to grab the machine account. We're going to relay that machine account to the DC, and now we have the ability to write to whatever attributes on the machine. So we can flip that thing of allowed to act on behalf of their identity, and then do a resource-based constrained delegation to take over the target that we just authenticated with as the machine account. So this was the a chunk was a little more complicated than this. This was the initial access vector for, if anyone was around for the hack LU CTF, they had active catalog 2, which was really sort of mind-bending to go through because I was looking through it, and it was just default AD domain. There's like absolutely nothing special about it, nothing turned on, nothing vulnerable. So I had to go through and be like, hey, how do you go and compromise this? And there's a couple extra steps here, right? But you can see like the crux of this is we do NTLM relay X, which is a thing that lets us like redirect the authentication type. We say, okay, cool, what's our target -T? It's LDAP secure, LDAP S on the domain controller, and then pull the RBCD attack. We're going to do -- delegate access and make compatible with late testing. And then we do our auth coercion with the FA2025 vulnerability and point it back to us. And then we're going to relay that to the domain controller, and we're going to use our unprivileged account, which is that CA board account. We're going to spin up a new random computer, a random username and password, modify the delegation rights. And now that malicious random computer, which doesn't even exist, it's not a real computer account, can now impersonate anyone we want on our target via S4 proxy. So, now I know what you guys are all thinking. That was too simple. That was too easy. Now I'm joking, but there's actually like 4 other things we need to do to pull this off. And I think the main thing that could clue you in is like, what is that weird domain record I just punched in? And this gets into some cryptographic mitigations that are supposed to stop this, but actually don't and can be bypassed. So the idea behind stopping the auth relay, apparently we're not going to stop auth coercion, that'd be crazy. We're just going to stop the auth relaying, is we're going to go say, okay, every time I disclose the NTLM or net NTLM, like challenge response, right, over the network, we're going to do a message integrity code. So that way an attacker can't snoop in the middle. There's an old CVE where, for of course, back compat, you could simply intercept it, drop the code, and send it forward. That was called the mic drop attack that got patched in 2019. But for old things, it's still a thing. So the idea is you wouldn't have the requisite like cryptographic material to go create a valid signature when you're doing this relay for a session you didn't establish. So that means that a lot of the real obvious SMB relaying techniques are now gone. When SMB signing is on. SMB signing is not always on by default, but it's on for the things you would probably care about a lot, like your domain controllers. For workstations, I think it might still be off by default. LDAP signing. LDAP signing is interesting. It prevents an unauthenticated attacker from relaying NTLM to do LDAP modify operations, like what we just did. Here's the cool thing about LDAP signing. It's off by default. Now you're thinking, is it going to stay that way? Yes. They tried to switch it to on by default in 2020, broke everything, turned it back off, and it's been like that ever since. So if we think about our default domain controller settings, machine account quota is 10, so we can spin up whatever machine accounts we want. LDAP signing is off. So we're looking pretty good in terms of our ability to go, relay authentication around and create computer accounts. So the question is then, if we have SMB signing on and LDAP signing is off, how do I do an authentication that would be like the SMB like hash disclosure, but without the signing, so that I can relay that wherever, right? How do I do an unsigned authentication attempt? So I can do my man in the middle, go forward it to LDAP. And this gets into a legacy thing called WebDAV. This was the genius idea that we can access websites with NetNTLM. And this is the legacy service that is still around. And there are a number of ways to actually make this start on your target. So not only can you auth coercion, but you can coerce your target to start up the web client service. And what's really interesting about WebDAV is, it's like SMB, it's a NetNTLM v2 auth over the network, but it's totally unsigned. Meaning all that SMB sign mitigation they put effort into making just goes out the window as long as you can use this. And we have ways of turning it on remotely. Now, I was lucky enough in this scenario that I didn't have to turn it on, it was already running. And you can trivially enumerate it just with an unprivileged log to say, hey, is this running? And if so, and you can do that probably auth coerce to an unsigned channel. The final piece of the puzzle is that because WebDAV is, of course, very security conscious, it won't just spit out your net NTLM v2 auth to anything that's like a random IP or a fully qualified domain name, right? Because then we'd be taking stuff from our domain and sending out to the internet. We don't want that. But of course, Active Directory in its infinite wisdom lets any user spin up AD DNS records on the domain control, as long as we're adding a new one and not overwriting. So all I can do to get around this FQDN limitation is basically make something that says, hey, here's a DNS record that points to Ronan's evil machine, right? Boom, send it. Cool. Domain controller says that's legit. And now I can just refer to that thing, not by FQDN, but by the actual like host of it, not the domain, and we're done. And we can now coerce this unsigned authentication. So this is the actual full chain for this attack, where we do our DNS entry, we spin up our NTLM RelayX server, point to the domain controller for LDAP. We do the NTLM over HTTP authentication coercion. Then it'll authenticate to LDAP on the DC as the account we coerced, which would be the server. We're going to do our machine account quota abuse, add an SPN for a computer account we control. We're going to flip the RBCD bit, and now we can compromise via S4U to self any account on the server to machine. Now this is super, super evil and super, super cool because ADI DNS, you can write that unprivileged by default. Machine account quota, 10 by default. LDAP signing, off by default. Meaning anytime you go see an Active Directory domain, you can go enumerate these three things plus check who is running web client. And everyone that's running web client and these things are satisfied, you can just go own them, right? And a big domain, I'm sure that's going to be a pretty large number of computers. So this is, even though it's complicated, this is definitely a chain that's worth being familiar with. Okay, so that was a lot. I know it was a lot. Does anyone have any questions on the theory or practice of doing delegation? Yeah. Okay. So this one, I don't have the theory down super well, I just have the practice of having done this a couple times. The idea is RBCD doesn't require domain admin to go write that. It requires writing it to the computer object itself. So if we look at the thing we're targeting, which would be service B, right? Service A in this case would be the malicious machine account we spin up, and service B would be our target. When we coerce service B and authenticate to our attacking machine, right? And then we relay that to the domain controller, guess who has the ability to write to service B's attributes? Well, service B does. And we just got their machine account back. Or at least their net intelligence to have prove and say, hey, I have the rightful ability to go flip this attribute. So the reason we can pull this off is because we auth coerce service B. If we can do it over an unsigned channel, we can use that to write back and modify attributes on the computer object in the domain, if we can relay it to the domain controller's LDAP. So the whole crux of the attack is that we are going to relay this through, and we're going to go flip it to RBCD trust this random computer over here, which is not even a real computer. It's a thing we just spun up to go abuse this. And then from there, it's very similar to the constrained delegation, where we can do a silver ticket type thing and go become anyone on that computer. Does that make sense? Hopefully. I know, yeah, there's a lot going on. If they would let me spin up the CTF again, I could just walk through it, but I think they pulled it down at this point to get scaled back there in front. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, why again don't we fix auth coercion?
I don't know. That's the $1 million question. I know in the oldest scenario is because we need printers to work. I don't actually remember the root cause behind Petit Patam, which is another like really common one. I don't know. I don't know why we don't fix it. They're like generally very easy to find, these bugs. So, and the other thing is too, you can of course auth coerce if you have like shell access, which is also really coerced just by like netuse or LSing something or opening up something in Explorer. So I think it's just baked into how Windows works. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know why it's not a vulnerability. I think the idea is if everything was firing on all cylinders cryptographically and we could stop relaying, you wouldn't actually get any additional access. It's just that's not the case in practice. Yeah, so when you combine that with some permissive defaults, you can pull off these like compromises. But yeah, I don't know why they don't fix it because like printer bug is very old and I think it's still around. So
Follow-up question.
yeah.
Why exactly is the like number of machines any random user can create set to 10?
I don't know. And every time I've seen a domain try to turn it down to 0, they end up like being like, oh no, people need to be able to add a computer account, and then bumping it back up to like 10 or 100. I don't know. I think it's just one of those things where people needed to go do their job or something.
What Jet uses for creating.
I believe it will let you hook up new computers to the domain without having to call your local domain admin, if that makes sense. So like, let's say you have a new computer and you want to go join it up to your Active Directory. I'm pretty sure that machine account quota will let any old person spin that up. Whereas if you had that at 0, you would need to go call a domain admin and be like, hey, can you go join this up? I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure that's how that works. So the idea is, of course, having machine account quota set to 0, which would stop this attack, would be really inconvenient.
And there's no way to like add people to a group that lets them.
Oh, you could probably do that. That would be a sensible way of fixing it. I'm pretty sure you could do that, actually.
The question is why by default Microsoft allows anyone to bring their computer at home into the network and allow the guy who joined it have full control of the computer. But
Probably the same reason that people are bringing iPhones into secure workspaces. But yeah, that is actually a really great segue, Krish, because that is still an abusable thing. So when you have groups that have these special sorts of powers, that will still enable you privilege escalation, just with extra steps. So when I'm going over DACL attacks, right, these are the exact same DACLs that I talked about for the Windows prevent beating. It's the exact same thing governed by STDLs. The only difference is that these are objects in the domain and not on the computer. So of course, if you are a savvy domain admin, you're like, hey, I don't want everyone to have all of the privileges. I'll follow principle of least privilege and go create these specific edges for these one-off permissions and assign them to groups, right? Which is totally fine. But once you get into that group, you can use it for some very controlled pivoting to move to the domain. So this is another thing you're going to see all the time. Like delegation, you'll see it usually about like machines. DACLs are very, very common when you're looking at groups or specific users. There are a lot of these edges in terms of like what you could configure. Like I think there's like 60 or 70 of them at a minimum. But the idea is because we can enumerate these, we do our Bloodhound ingest, and we go build our graph of all of the things we can go control. And we can come up with certain abilities and use that. So if you have a bunch of different groups, there will usually be some kind of very tricky path you can walk that'll let you go take some things over. And I'll just show you instead of talking about it. So an example would be generic all. Generic all is as simple as it gets. That's like something that you can fully modify, set any attribute on that object. That's what generic all is. So user A, again, you're looking to go separate your privileges. So like, hey, user B is going to be controlled by someone user A, like user A's group. Right. Well, then you would limit that modification to folks with the generic all edge over B. But exploitation is not that hard. So you can write all the objects, well, all the attributes of an object. You can reset the password, right, for a user account. If you have generic all in a group, you could change who's in the group. If you have generic all in a computer, like we just saw, we could write to the MSDS allowed to act on behalf of their identity and set up an RBCD attack. So that's the idea. Is even if you're doing your privileges in a more granular way, you could have edges like this. Like this is really a bad picture. Let's see if I have a better one. Yeah. Okay. So just skipping ahead for a picture of what this would actually look like. I'll go explain these for a second. This is the edge I did over the CTF this weekend, where this one user who was like the account admin, because this is Swedish for account admins, they could add people to the account admins group. And the account admins group could go add random accounts, including machine accounts, right? And this edge called all extended rights. So this is an example of, yeah, they have granular permissions, sure, but if I can get into there, I can go follow that chain. And just so happened that that user was actively logged in to the server too in the CTF, right? So I was able to go do my RBCD webdev relay, compromise server 2, log into server 2, impersonate that person, and then go through this chain. So what does that chain look like? Well, it depends on the edge, right? So you can have generic write, which is like generic all, but you can just write to certain privileged fields. And these do kind of what you would imagine, right? If I can write to a group, well, I can add people to the group. If I can write to a user, usually I can change their password. If I can write to a computer, I can do RBCD, or I'll go into next week an attack called shadow credentials, which is like making a private key for them. Right, so that's the idea. Is we have fields, we can go right to them, and you should know pretty much or be able to think of a lot of the privileged fields by default. There are also, just like privileged writes, privileged reads. So you can have something called local administrator password solution. This is like a common thing you can have set up where a computer will manage local admin password and you can have it manage your domain. Well, that's cool. But if you have this edge, right, you can go read that lapsed password and then become local admin on the computer. So we have privileged writes, we have privileged reads, and then there's these other like special edges. So all extended rights is a really interesting one because even though it's not really documented that you can do this, this one actually gives you write privilege over the machine account password. Which if you can write to the machine account password, well, now we have the cryptographic material to go do an S4U to self. So I can overwrite this password and then do an S4U to self as a local admin on the target via TGS, which is neat because if you have all extended rights on a domain controller or something, you can do secret stuff on it. I think it'll work on any computer account. So these are just example DACLs. There are a bunch of these. It's not worth memorizing them because what will happen is if you open up the Bloodhound, you see that. When you click on this, every one of these will include a guide with specific commands. as to why does this exist, what problem does it solve, and how do we abuse it. So this is just a granular thing, right? Because when you want to do your pen testing, like a breadth first search, you look, are there any obvious vulnerabilities we can do to get domain admin? No. Okay, cool. Can I pull off any cheesy stuff to go like do a machine account relay and take over really privileged machine accounts? You know, if the answer is no, then you would start looking over more granular stuff like this. You scope in narrowly to go save yourself time and try easy stuff first and move on to more complex attacks. And this would be one of those more complex scenarios. Okay, so DACLs, I think, are conceptually a lot easier than delegation. It's just, again, like things we can modify. The last thing I want to go over is cross-domain attacks. So let's say, if you recall from last week, we have the ability to go get into a child domain controller. How do we get into a parent or go from a parent to a child, right? And this is a little bit conceptually annoying, but it's actually in practice pretty easy. So the idea is you'll have a trust. Well, what is a trust? A trust relationship lets users in one domain authenticate and access resources in another domain. And the idea is, well, like a Kerberos referral. So it'll be like, hey, other domain controller, I'm coming from someone on my domain. Please go process this and tell me if they have access. That's the idea. Is you're like forwarding it to the other domain and saying, hey, you know, can I go get this access? And you will have an inter-realm trust key, which will be your like one of your sources of secrets for that cross-domain TGT. So you'll send it with your inter-realm trust key, and the foreign domain will go decrypt it and be like, okay, do they have access? Now there are 4 types of trust, and it's a 2x2 matrix. It's, do we trust in one way or both ways? And is it transitive or non-transitive? And of course, transitivity is always really, really fun. So a one-way trust lets people in the trusted domain access resources in the trusting domain, but not the other way around. And a two-way trust with peak engineering is just 2 one-way trusts, pointing in opposite directions. That's it. That's all a two-way trust is. So what's really cool is that basically when you have a child domain, the child domain is trusted by the parent, which makes exploitation pretty easy. So the other sort of confusing piece of terminology, and you should just know this for looking at like the Bloodhound graph, is that when you have a one-way trust, it's labeled as inbound or outbound relative to the perspective of how you're looking at it. So if domain A trusts domain B, then domain A is the trusting domain and domain B is the trusted domain. So B has power over A. And domain A would have, from its perspective, a one-way outbound trust because it was trusting this other thing to go mess with it, right? And domain B would consider this to be a one-way inbound trust from its perspective. And then the other thing is transitivity is whether trust can be changed. We have domains A, B, and C. A trusts B trusts C. Does A trust C? And this is determined by the transitivity of the trust. What makes this really, really fun is if C is owned by somebody completely different from A, say a managed service provider, right? And they can go pivot through there. But that's nothing to worry about, on your own time. The most common case you're going to go see is a parent-child trust, which you can tell by like the subdomain, right? If you have your illinois.edu, and then let's say we have like ece.illinois.edu or something, right? ECE would be your child, and the root domain would be the parent. Now, whenever you add a child domain, it creates a transitive two-way trust with its parent, which immediately tells you that is like the most trust you can have, right? That is like absolutely zero security boundary between these two things. So the idea is, if we have domain admin on the child, we can use a trick called SID history, just make a golden ticket up to the parent, which is scary because now if I want to compromise, illinois.edu, and I can hit any of the child domain controllers, then you can pull this and go get a golden ticket on all of illinois.edu. So you can basically go from this child, hop up, and hop down to any child or the root domain, like compromise all of the things. So what is SID history? Why does it exist? I don't really know. But practically, this will allow you, using this attribute, to go forge golden tickets. So again, practically, this should tell you, get into the child domain. If you do that by default, you can go hop up, compromise the parent domain, buy the golden ticket. And once you have the golden ticket and the parent, because it's a two-way transitive trust, you can go take over anybody, any other child domain or the entire root domain. That's the idea behind your cross-forest attack. Yeah. Now there are, of course, other types of attacks, depending on how it's set up. So parent-child is the easiest. You just use SID history, make a golden ticket. If the trust is inbound from our perspective, then folks in our domain can be granted access to resources in the remote domain. 9 times out of 10, if this exists, the idea is that admins in our domain will also probably be admins in the remote domain, and you can do cross-domain enumeration, or you can just try it and it'll probably work. Yeah. Yeah. Let's say we have domain A, domain B, and domain C. Right. So if domain A has like transitively trusts domain B, so like domain B can, make sure I'm getting the ordering right. But the idea basically is that you would be able to chain trusts like any other kind of transitivity. So let me read exactly what I wrote down so I don't mess up. Yeah. Yeah, practically the idea is you can multi-hop. That's it. That's mostly what it is. So you have A trust B, B trust C. Does A trust C? That's the idea, is can you do like a multi-hop? So for any parent-child scenario, the answer is yes. But for cross-forest stuff, it can be different. Because if you're doing like domains to completely separate domains, that can be configured pretty much however. And the idea is that would be a security boundary, but in practice, it's often not as hard. Because you can have what's called foreign groups, where basically you'll have a group in the remote domain, and you'll be included from your current domain, having whatever powers those are, and you can do cross like domain enumeration and just see, does such a foreign group exist? And if so, you just log in, right? And it's like that easy. So. And practically how this works is request a TGT for your target user and saying, hey, I request a referral ticket in the current domain for target domain. And then target domain will check and be like, okay, cool, do you have rights to do this? If so, it'll give you TGT, and then you can use that to request your TGSs. Okay, so the last most restrictive type is a one-way outbound, which is almost nothing we can do. Because that's the idea, is we trust somebody else, but they don't trust us. There is one trick, though, that you can pull, which is that they have a shared credential for any kind of trust, even if we have no powers. And that lets us use that shared credential to do basically a totally unprivileged domain user logon on it. And that is via the shared credential for the trust. So that's the idea. It's like this random domain object rotates password every 30 days, but you can at least pivot to an unprivileged domain user. This one is pretty lame, but it is still worth knowing about. Okay, so I know that was a lot. The main thing I think to take away is delegation is dangerous. Default settings are dangerous. You can put that together in a lot of cases to compromise a bunch of machine accounts and potentially turn that into a total domain compromise. And if that doesn't work, you can, of course, enumerate your active like users and groups and try and do other pathfinding via DACL attacks. And if you're able to climb your way to domain admin, and you have like a parent-child relationship, you can request a golden ticket and hop up and do a complete domain compromise across domain controllers. Okay. And then next week will be the last week that I torture you with Active Directory, and I will go over one of the most commonly misconfigured, very dangerous things, which is their Active Directory certificate implementation, MS SQL servers, which are shockingly privileged. I might do a little bit on smart cards and cross-protocol relays. So like we saw the WebDAV relay, this would be relaying 2 Active Directory certificates and vice versa. And then if I have time, maybe a little bit on SCCM, which is like this big, scary sole source of truth where also for, of course, back-compat reasons, you would have the SCCM admin password on any workstation you compromise, which is really scary because you can basically compromise that workstation, hop into SCCM, and use it to own everything. So yeah, I'll go over all that. I think the plan is no blue team meeting this Thursday. We might go over and do some Cyberforce prep, but yeah. And then I think after we go through Active Directory, I'll either have Min and Emma perhaps run a meeting on cloud attacks, or we'll go straight into malware and doing like stealthy attack chains. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I had planned.